Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to April 23rd. It is a lovely spring day in suburban Chicago. The cars are zipping by, the sun is out, the birds are calling, and it's a wonder to be alive today. I'm excited to talk to you today. I encountered something inspirational, a bit of conversation that leads to ideas I am keen to discuss. My students were eager to talk about it. Well, not really, but as a professor, I can make them talk. And so today we're going to talk about remix. We're going to talk about the currency of ideas, the notion of shared creativity, parallel creativity, and so on. I know in the past we've talked about gift culture, so this overlaps a little bit with things we've talked about before, but it never hurts to explore again. The impetus for this discussion comes from an email I got today. I backed the Werewords Deluxe Edition, recently launched by Bezier Games as part of their continuing publication schedule for their game Werewords. I've heard it's very good. It's a fun social deduction game. The price was pretty decent, and so I participated in that Kickstarter. In their post today, I encountered something that I thought was just swell, and I thought I would discuss it. But before I did, I wanted to back up a little bit and share with you a little history of Werewords, which already has a kind of interesting background for this conversation. If you aren't aware of the game, I'm going to back up and tell you about a different game first. So a couple years ago, the company Oink Games, which is a small publisher out of Japan, released a very small box game, as their games tend to be, about based on the idea of 20 questions. In their game, players are sitting around playing 20 questions, and their goal is to answer the question, what is the word that we're trying to find? But one of the people in the group is an insider. They know more about the word that's being pursued than the other players, and their goal is to help the players figure out the answer without being so obvious that the other players figure out they're the ones who are helping them figure out the answer. If that's confusing, just think about the idea that the players, we don't want the players to know, how do I explain it? The insider doesn't want the players to know who they are, but they do want the players to solve the puzzle. The players want to solve the puzzle, but they also want to figure out who the insider is. That's the idea of insider. It's supposed to be pretty fun. It got a lot of buzz when it came out. Well, a little while later, Ted Alspach, the creator of Werewolf, the game, and subsequent games like One Night, Ultimate Werewolf, and a variety of other games, published a game called Werewords. And Werewords also used the 20 questions as its basic starting model, and also did a bunch of other stuff. It had introduced roles, it had multiple teams, there's werewolves trying to hide who they are. So Werewords ultimately used 20 questions as its starting point as well, but it developed it in a different way. It had teams, it had roles, it had the werewolf theme, so it was sort of reflective of the werewolf idea that people are familiar with, and it just engaged with the concept a bit differently than did the original game. Well, when word of Werewords came out, and I think Werewords was new right around the time of Origins last year, Oink Games tweeted a bunch of times that basically said, hey, Ted Alspach stole our idea. Really what they said is Ted Alspach inquired about licensing it, and we said no, and then he went and made his game anyway. So Ted Alspach published a reply, and he said, in his reply, which is on, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. In his reply, basically, he says, He doesn't like to get in fights in the internet, but his reputation is being impugned, so he wanted to explain his side of the story and the timeline regarding Werewords. He said that, like many game designers, he has dozens or hundreds of designs in various stages of development at any time. And one of the games he was working on was built around the idea of a group of people trying to guess a word, like Codenames or like Password or many other games. When he played Insider, he thought it would be an interesting fit, and he inquired about licensing the game. According to his version of events, he had one or two exchanges of ideas with Oink Games, and they never got back to him. So he continued developing the game that he had originally started with, and it turned into Werewords. So his argument is parallel evolution. We were both working on that at the same time. And that kind of ended up being it because, and we could talk about this at another time, but the long and short of it is game mechanisms are not copyrightable and they would have to be patented. But at the heart of it, Oink Games was using a very common trope, that game 21, and so for them to say Ted Alsbach had swiped it is to not acknowledge that they were in fact using a well-established genre anyway. And he probably has records of playtests and other things that show parallel development in the game. He also, in his discussion, talks about all the things Werewords does that are different than what Insider does. And he suggests that they made their claims without ever having played Werewords, and he thought that was irresponsible. So as far as I know, they never replied to that, and as far as I can tell, most people didn't really take sides. Or if they did, they took sides with Alsbach. I did not see very much communication online in which people said, oh, Alsbach has stolen this. Most people just kind of said, yeah, ideas that are similar come out at the same time together. Hopefully this episode is usable. I've got an ambulance that's just hanging around in the background, adding a bit of urgency or chaos to the background. So hopefully you're not getting traumatic stress from the sound of the sirens. So that was the minor controversy around Werewords that started, was that it was sort of similar to Insider, and so I certainly heard people reviewing Werewords and saying it fired Insider for them. So whether or not Oink Games really had a case that Alsbach was borrowing from them, he certainly covered enough of the same ground that people saw it as needing one or the other. I will say for myself, I was not interested enough in Insider to buy it, but I was interested in Werewords. It has more going on. And so, like I said, I backed the deluxe Kickstarter. So, that brings me to the email today. It's something I thought was really interesting. So today, Alsbach sends out a update to the Werewords campaign, sort of talking about where they are right now. And then he mentions another game that is currently on Kickstarter called Growl. Now, if you read Growl feels like a game that was created, inspired by Werewolf, which, if you don't know the series of that, it was invented in the 80s by a mathematician. And I'm not sure whether Alsbach licensed Werewolf when he made it into a game, but probably not. So it feels like a game that was inspired by Werewolf that may or may not reflect One Night Ultimate Werewolf, but is built around the idea of this hidden role game where you have a werewolf, and the big innovation is that the werewolf is turning other people into werewolves. That's the twist of it. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to play, so it's in the same realm as the One Night Werewolf series, and it's got different roles, so it feels a lot like One Night Ultimate Werewolf. Enough so that I almost didn't back it, because it feels so much like One Night Ultimate Werewolf, but it does do some different things as well, which I think make it interesting and worth examining. So that's what Growl is. Nonetheless, the significant overlap in theme, in playtime, in broad characteristics like roles and hidden and social deduction and timing and so on, could suggest to someone that Growl is significantly intruding on the One Night Ultimate Werewolf space. So, with that in mind, I was really intrigued to read Alsbach's message that came out as part of the Werewords Kickstarter. He writes, I'm going to read it here. Growl. We're always on the lookout for new and innovative social deduction games, and Growl looks to combine a little bit of hand management with social deduction. The premise is that a werewolf is slowly turning all players into werewolves, though not too slowly, as the game only takes about 15 minutes. It looks like to be an exciting mix of werewolf-like mechanics with some card drafting thrown in, and we're definitely looking forward to receiving our copy. You can check it out here. And then they have a link to the Growl Kickstarter. Well, I say, stay classy, Ted Alsbach. Dang. That is an incredible nod to the history and practice of innovation in game design to look at a project that is essentially overlapping yours in many vectors and say, this looks like a neat new twist on the genre. Go for it, Growl, and actually point your supporters toward it. Well done. So that brings me to the topic today, which I've used up most of my time telling you about the history of Werewords and the idea of Growl, but that's the interesting narrative anyway. Now here's the button. As we study the creative arts, especially in the digital age when the logic of the new creation is copy-paste, it becomes ever more evident that the creative arts are a practice of borrowing, recombining, expanding, standing on the shoulders of. And in the board game hobby, where things are exploding like gangbusters, where Kickstarter has given a new venue for smaller publishers to bring their ideas to the market, where the internet has allowed for a blossoming of a conversational community in ways that we've never seen before. The board game hobby is especially benefiting from the ability to copy and recombine what other people are doing in interesting ways. The history of creativity depends on this kind of copying. You can't there's no art form that doesn't depend on previous art forms or previous versions of itself for the new versions of itself. Whereas before we used to draw the line at originality in imagining the idea of a plot being new enough that it counts as original. We generally saw the mechanisms, the things that people use to make the art, as borrowable. Now in board games, mechanisms are generally seen as the creative thing, and borrowing them carries a little bit more weight because people recognize it in a way they don't necessarily recognize borrowings of cinematic tropes. Although I will say you can definitely track through the late 90s and early 2000s the borrowings of editing tropes from people like Quentin Tarantino. But we're in an era now where people are hyper alert to all of these questions, and there's the potential for real trouble if individuals start overthinking their contribution and underthinking the role that community and conversation play in how we understand the nature of creativity. That, to paraphrase a popular YouTube video series, everything is a remix. Actually, that's not paraphrasing, that's the title of the series. Everything's a remix. So as you're looking at games and you're thinking about how does this game influence that one, it's easy to sometimes think, well, that game just rips off this other game. But it's the innovations, it's the changings, it's the slow increment from publisher to publisher and version to version that allows the hobby to move forward so quickly and gives us such interesting new elements in our research, in our hobby. And it's through people acknowledging the role that kind of copying plays that we find the real benefits of the hobby. When individuals are willing to acknowledge that their ideas will be borrowed and will be expanded upon by other people, and they welcome that borrowing because they recognize their own role in doing the borrowing themselves, that's where we get the real benefit to the kind of creative exchange we're seeing in the hobby. So, leads me to my question, what kinds of creativity have you seen in the hobby? Where have you seen games borrow, and have you seen games borrow too much? What makes you think a game could borrow too much or not enough? Pop into our new guild. We have a Board Game Geek guild I guess I should probably know the number of the guild. You can find the link in our show notes. I'll memorize that for future. And say hello. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at rattleboxgames or by email brendan@rattleboxgames.com. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a lovely one. I hope your next walk is just as lovely. Take care. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.